2018 6th Annual Inclusion Collaborative State Conference, and my name is Kathy Wall. I'm delighted to be back. I didn't plan to moderate this, but I'm going to. And I just wanted to introduce Dr. Ilene Schwartz, who is one of the authors of the Building Blocks Preschool Inclusion book that we have loved, and we're in the 3rd edition now. I went through a lot of 2nd editions, I'll have you know. And we are honored that she's here. She flew down from Washington, and she is being sponsored by Brooks Publishing. So let's all give her a big clap, virtually and in person. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you guys hear me? Is this working okay? Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me here today. First, I love coming to California. I grew up in California, and so it's always fun to be able to come back. And I live in the state of Washington now. But then it's always so wonderful to be surrounded by so many people who are doing the work, the hard work on inclusion, and that's what you guys are doing. So I am thrilled to be here. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about how an overview of the building blocks framework, but specifically on really talking about how we provide instruction using this framework. So one of the things that when I talk about inclusion here, I'm going to start off with the assumption that we have already made the decision to move towards inclusion, and we've done the hard team building work and the hard work on joint visions and how we think together about all children, because I'm really talking about implementation. Now, what we know is that if you don't spend the time doing that hard work, the implementation's not going to work, because you have to work together to come up on shared values and shared ideas and how we, what we think about inclusion. But that's not the purpose of this talk. So I'll talk just a minute about it, but then we're going to jump really into inclusion. I also encourage you to ask questions throughout, and I know that we have people joining us virtually, so I know that you're going to have to use a microphone if you do want to ask questions, but I think that I will try to stop periodically to ask folks for questions, but if you have one that is a burning question, please feel free to let me know. And the last thing is that if you have any questions that we don't get to today, my email is on the handout, and I hope that feel free to email me, and I hope that you use these handouts, because they're very, I would be thrilled to know that other people are using them. If you're following along on the ones that are online, I changed the order of them a little bit this morning. That's what happens when you have a plane ride and you have a computer at the ready. So if they're in a little bit different order, don't be worried. So let me tell you what our objectives are today. First, I want us to really think about what the building blocks model is and understand what that works, what that model is and how it works. And then I want to talk about how we plan for an individual child. We've all been doing inclusion. Many of us in the room have been doing inclusion for many, many years. And unfortunately, I still sometimes hear parents tell me that they are told that they have to choose between instruction or inclusion. And that is a choice that no one should have to make. That what we know is that there are very effective instructional strategies that can be implemented with high fidelity in inclusive classrooms and yield very positive student outcomes. So I just want us to think about how that planning happens, because what we know is that if you don't plan it, it will not happen. And I think it's even more so in an inclusive classroom. Then I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of routine-based assessment and what that might tell us that a more standardized look at assessment may not. And then how the fourth things I want to talk about how we match objectives with that routines-based assessment and figure out what kind of support we need to provide to every learner. And then finally, I want to talk about an activity matrix, because one of my favorite things from the whole book is this activity matrix. And I think if it was the one thing, if I was given one thing that every teacher had to use, it would be the activity matrix, because I think it accomplishes so much in planning and organization and just joint vision of what's happening in a classroom. And with that, we're going to start. So here's the building block matrix. Building block framework. Now, we're very clear that we call this a framework and not a curriculum, not a strategy. We chose the word framework intentionally, and the reason that we said we wanted to call it the building blocks framework is because this is a framework that you can use with any curriculum that you're already using. If you're using the creative curriculum, it works. If you're using high scope, it works. If you're using a more local curriculum, it works. And it also, although our work has been primarily with younger children, we also know that it works across age levels. Because if you were in an elementary school classroom and you wanted to implement the building blocks framework, you could take the same slide and just change that, the lettering in the blue slide to say high quality elementary school program. Because really, when you look at this is a multi-tiered systems of support, right? It's, the same kind of idea as PBIS or any kind of tiered support. There's universal supports, there's secondary supports, there's tertiary supports. Or as we like to say, there's stuff that everyone gets, there's stuff that some people get, and then there's stuff that only a few students need. But this idea that it's built on a strong foundation is essential to all inclusive practices. Because if the general ed basic program is not a high quality, and I'm using that general ed program even though I know many of you may be working in childcare or Head Start or whatever, but if the universal program is not high quality, then it doesn't matter what supports you add on top of it, you're not going to have a high quality program. So I kind of think about it as if you go into a restaurant and you sit down at a table and you get the wobbly table, it's no matter how many sugar packets you put under the leg of the table, you're worried when the soup comes because your table is wobbly. So no matter how good of the things that you put on top are, if the foundation's not strong, it's going to tumble down. So this idea of building that foundation is so important. And I think that sometimes we forget that part of it, and we say, because many of us are here because we're special educators, and so we assume that the rest is high quality. And I just want to one more time say it's so essential for us to make sure that universal program is of the very highest quality, using things like universal design for learning, using things like positive behavior support, making sure that there's a positive social emotional learning climate in the classroom. So just to give you, I know that at this conference I don't need to talk about what inclusion is, but I just wanted to kind of start with a few slides that I always like to use to kind of set the stage. And this is a case that you guys know well because it's a California case, although it was settled in the Ninth Circuit, which is the O'Berty case. But I love this quote that says, "Inclusion is a right, not a privilege for a select few." And when we as educators in school districts and citizens adopt this idea that inclusion should be the starting place, that every person, every child, every student has a right to attend their neighborhood school, or what I like to say, because in Washington many people don't attend their neighborhood school, attend the school that they would be attending if they didn't have a disability. So where would you go? Would you go to the same school your siblings go to? Would you go to is it a neighborhood school? If it's not a neighborhood school, why was that choice made? But the idea is that I have that right to go to school, and then it's the obligation of the district to meet my needs. It's not the obligation, it's not that because I have disability X that I should be placed at one school, but if I have disability Y, I get placed at a different school. And unfortunately, that still happens a lot. I know it happens in Washington. I don't know if it happens in California, but I'm seeing heads nod, so I know that it does. And this system is so silly because, when we think about so many disability categories, they're socially constructed. So I think about one family that I know specifically, and what they did is they had a child who has a number of diagnoses, as many young children do, and they really wanted him to attend his neighborhood school. And the neighborhood school had a really great program for children who are diagnosed with apraxia, which is a language production disorder. So he had a diagnosis of autism. So they said, oh no, you can't come here. You have apraxia. We don't do apraxia here. And so he went to a different school. They were fighting it. And after, like 5 years of fighting it, when he aged out of the elementary school, they changed his diagnosis to apraxia. And it was like so silly because, again, a diagnosis is just a description. It's not a prescription. So I think about the children with whom I work mainly with young children with autism. And in the program we run, which we're called Project Data, also a Brooks product, where children spend half a day in an inclusive classroom and then half a day receiving more intensive instruction in kind of an early intensive behavioral intervention format, but at school. We have children in that program that are learning to point to request, and other children who can tell me the entire lineup of the Seattle Mariners and a little biography on every one of the players, and they all have a diagnosis of autism. So knowing that diagnosis tells me nothing about what they need for intervention because it's a description, it's not a prescription. So we have to remember that we need to continue to look at children functionally and figure out what it is that they need to have the very best outcomes. So the next thing I like to say about inclusion is that we know that inclusion is not just a set of strategies or a placement issue. Now, we know we have a whole bunch of set of strategies and some great tools, like the fantastic tools that are sitting on your table right now, but inclusion is about belonging. It's about belonging to a community, a group of friends, a school, and a neighborhood. And what accommodations do people put in place so that you can not just belong, but you can participate in an authentic manner, and that you can achieve important and meaningful outcomes. So we know that being there is not enough, but you can't belong if you're not there. So how are you there, and how does the system support you to be an authentic participant in that setting? The next slide, I like to, again, this is the last slide we're going to talk about generally about inclusion. And this summarizes some research that my colleagues, Kat Peck, Chris Angelucci, Debbie Staub, and I did at the University of Washington. And we were really interested in finding out or identifying some of the outcomes that children achieve when they're in inclusive settings. And some people might say, well, we don't need to worry about that. It's their right. They need to be there. But it's also important to know what kids are learning. And we all know the birthday party story, right? Where a parent tells you, my child was in a segregated setting until they were in 3rd grade and they'd never been invited to a birthday party. And then after they were included for 1 year, they started getting invited to birthday parties. I didn't even know who some of these kids were. It was so great. We'd go to the supermarket and people would say hello to my son. I didn't even know who they were. His social network grew so much. Those are great stories, but we wanted to see, could we really come up with some more defined categories that apply to students really from preschool through high school about the kinds of outcomes they achieved in inclusive settings. So the first thing we did is we watched kids for about 5 years, and we followed children in all of the settings. We talked to their parents, we talked to them when they could talk to us, we talked to their peers, we talked to their teachers. And what we found is that children benefit because they participate in a community of practice. Now, it's interesting because that idea of a community of practice is something that we as adults, we as teachers talk about all the time. And we know it's important for us that we learn better when we're part of a community of practice. Well, so do children. And they learn by participating in valued rituals, routines, and activities. So what are the things that are going on in the classroom that are valued, or in the school that are valued, and how do children learn through them? So we said within this community of practice that there were 3 big outcome domains that we saw. The first was membership, that we saw where people in the school, people in the classroom, people in the community made accommodations so that children with disabilities could participate in a meaningful way. And sometimes they were thought up by the children. So in a school where we were doing some research, we saw literacy groups where they'd have a child who was nonverbal or someone who didn't want to talk in front of the group. And when they were doing the little play, they had a sign that that child could hold up when it was time for their line, rather than having to say it out loud. So that was a simple accommodation that the students thought up. The teachers didn't even have to do that. And then we saw other bigger things, like we observed in churches where kids who were nonverbal participated in church choirs and were full members of that choir. The fact they didn't sing, well, that didn't matter. They were part of the group. They belonged. We also saw relationships, and when we talk about relationships, we talk more about one-on-one, student-to-student relationships, as opposed to membership being how you interact with the group. And in relationships, we saw a range of relationships develop. Sometimes kids were peers, which means they just kind of hung out together. Sometimes they were tutors. Typically developing kids would tutor the kids with disabilities. Sometimes the kids with disabilities would tutor or help the typically developing kids. It went both ways. In the really good programs, it went both ways. There was play and companionship. Sometimes we would just play a game together. And there was conflict, because kids sometimes have conflict with each other, and they needed to learn how to solve that, because conflict happens. Now, you notice that one of the kinds of relationships that we didn't include was friend, because to me, we thought a friend is all of those. A friend is when you sometimes help each other, you sometimes get helped by your friends, and sometimes they help you, and sometimes you hang out, and sometimes you play. Sometimes you have conflict and you solve those things. But a friendship is rich, and it includes all kinds of relationships. And then, of course, we had the skills outcomes. And, we never want to forget those. So just as important it is that children are members and they develop rich social relationships, but they also need to learn, to read and write and, arithmetic and motor skills and executive function skills and communication skills, and all those things that in special ed we're really good at naming and describing and measuring. We don't want to ever discount those, because if we're thinking about what goes into teaching children skills so that they can have a self-determined life, then they need those skills. Yeah, I've started now using, when I think about the outcomes we want for children, I now use this term that Marsha Linehan developed. So Marsha Linehan is a psychologist, and she developed a treatment called dialectic behavior therapy, DBT, that's used a lot with people who are suicidal and people with borderline personality disorder. But she talks about one of the things we want to do for everyone is help them develop a life worth living. And I think it's such a nice phrase to think about what we want to do for our students. Now, for those of us in early childhood, it's sometimes hard to be thinking about, what's this child going to be doing in high school or post-high school, or are they going to college or work or whatever, because they're 3. But, we always need to have our eye on that. And so we need to be saying, what are we doing in our school programming to help these children develop a life worth living, these children and their families? So how do we do that? Well, we do that through implementing the building blocks framework. So here are the steps to implementing the building blocks framework. And again, these may not look that different to you than implementing any other kind of framework. And we have some tools that I'm going to show you that will hopefully help you think about these. So the first is to assess the quality of the learning environment, okay? So again, that's really looking at that bottom block and thinking about, is that universal program high quality? And that universal program can be evaluated by any existing standard. If your state has a QRIS plan, and that's how you want to assess quality, if you use the Eckers or some other kind of measure, if it's an elementary school and you use something else, the issue is that we have to make sure that the program is of high quality and meets the needs of the community that it serves. So one of the things that we know about programs is that, you know, a program that works beautifully in Saratoga, California, may not work beautifully in Seattle, Washington, okay? Where a program sits, context and culture always matter. And you have to look at how it fits in the current context and addresses the current culture. The next thing we want to do is look at the classroom schedule, because what we want to do is create a schedule that allows children to participate in a meaningful way across the schedule. So rather than saying, well, I need to teach this motor skill at 10 o'clock because that's when it's convenient for me, we have to say, well, when would this child be using this motor skill in the classroom? So if this is a motor skill that would be used during outdoor time, then when does outdoor time happen? If it doesn't happen till 11, and you say, well, I need to do it at 10, then that's when you have to start that negotiation process. Well, why do you need to do it at 10? You know, or is there a possibility of changing the classroom schedule? But to say I'm going to try to teach it in an artificial way creates many, many barriers. Not only is it less effective, but we know that we have fewer chances of generalization of a new skill if it's taught in an artificial way. And what we know about teaching is that, you know, I don't care if a child can demonstrate a skill to me in a therapy room or an isolated classroom. I want to make sure that they learn this skill in a way that they can use it so it improves the quality of their life. And doing it in a little therapy room it might improve the quality of my life because my data look better, but it's not improving the quality of their life. So we want to think about that. We want to gather information on individual goals and objectives to see what's currently happening and are those meeting those needs. Assess the learning needs of the child. Clarify the current concerns of the child and family and teachers. So, you know, if a teacher is really concerned because a child can't do something in the classroom and it's interfering with their ability to participate, then we have to work with that teacher to problem solve that. You know, to say, how do we work around that? We're going to create a plan. We're going to construct an activity matrix, implement the plan, because implementation is key. I know that, I'm sure none of you do this, but I'm seeing beautiful plans that never get implemented. Beautiful IEPs that don't get followed. That's not what this is about, right? We want to see things that are usable, and then evaluate. So let's start with talking about individual learning objectives. So, you know, many children with IEPs young children with disabilities should either have an IFSP, an individualized family education program, or, an individual family service plan, or an IEP, an individualized education plan. And again, in most states, birth to 3, you have an IFSP. At 3, you get an IEP. We also want children who need one to have a behavior support plan. So what I define as someone who needs one is for any child who has a behavior that is chronic enough that you're talking about it more than once a week. Okay? So, you know, every child, regardless of their disability status, probably engages in aggression at some point and in school during their childhood. those kids don't need a behavior support plan. But if teachers are talking about a behavior every week, then that's a chronic behavior. And then it is our obligation to complete a functional behavior assessment and a behavior support plan for that child. Because what we know about behavior is that it is functionally based. So, this may be the biggest change I've seen in behavior in my career, is that we used to, when challenging behavior would occur, when I first started, we would say that is a bad behavior and we need to get rid of it. Now when challenging behavior occurs, we still say that's a bad behavior and we need to get rid of it, but we know that the child is doing it for a purpose. What function does this serve for the child? So I think about some of the programs I see for kids with autism have a lot of unnecessary repetition in it. And so, when I see a child who's been given a puzzle, the same puzzle, 10 days in a row, and on day 11 they throw it at the teacher, I think the function of that is, no thank you, I don't want to do the same puzzle again on day 11. But they don't know how to say that in a way that is appropriate. So, but there's a clear function. It's still inappropriate to throw a puzzle at a teacher, even if you don't want to do it again. But you need to then understand the function so that you can create a plan to teach the student an alternative, think about curricular alternatives to, number one, prevent the problem and know what to do if it does occur. We can also use to evaluate that. So when we're thinking about learning objectives, number one, go to their IEP or IFSP. Number two, we go to curriculum-based assessments. And the curriculum-based assessment that we use a lot with our children with disabilities is the AEPS, the Assessment Evaluation Programming System that was developed by Diane Bricker and her colleagues. And we also use TS Gold, which is part of the creative curriculum. But then we also want to observe children in the routines in our classroom, because that's going to give us some really important information about how they can use the skills functionally and with a natural level of support. Because sometimes we create assessment opportunities where a child is one-on-one and they can do the skill in that setting, but in fact in the classroom, the child might be 1-on-10. And can they do the skill in the classroom? So we have to look at the behavior in the natural environment. So within every plan, within every individual plan, we want to look at the strengths and weaknesses of every child. A friend of mine used to say that an IEP is a list of all the things that you're really bad at, and you get to practice it 6 hours a day. Who wouldn't want to sign up for that? But the reality is that an IEP should be thinking about the areas in which you need support and the areas that you're good at and in which you want to get better at. So the person I think who talks about this in the most inspirational way is Temple Grandin. So how many people have heard of Temple Grandin? Okay, so most of you. So, Temple Grandin is an adult with autism, and she is a professor at Colorado State University, and she's had a movie made about her, so it's really an awesome HBO movie. But what she always talks about is that if you have a child with autism who is good at drawing, don't just say, okay, drawing, that's great. When they earn some free time, we'll put some crayons out. Enroll them in art lessons. Help them get better at those things. So in the same way that we would do with typically developing children. But we also want to make sure that we don't ignore weaknesses. So if we have a child who doesn't hold a pencil, we need to give them practice in how to do that. Because you can't practice it, you can't get better at it if you don't practice it. And sometimes we may say we don't like things because we don't know how to do them. We've never had that experience. So, one of the things that I see with many of our young students with autism is they'll get into kindergarten and first grade and their writing skills are terrible. Their handwriting skills are terrible. And so I will often ask, so how much time does this child spend drawing and coloring and things, working with chalk, painting, whatever, making marks on paper, basically? Oh, none. Well, let's think about how much time a typically developing child often spends doing that. So that is a precursor to being able to write. So if you never do that because you choose not to, then you're not going to get better. So you have to, that's something you have to work on. Now, you don't have to work on it all day long, but you might say, okay, every child needs to spend at least 5 minutes a day drawing or coloring, okay? Easy. Addressing weaknesses as well as strengths. Same with curriculum reference assessments. The good thing about curriculum reference assessments is that rather than saying this child is, functions like a 2, at a 2.6 age level, which I don't know, that doesn't really tell me a lot. And it's especially kind of a bad idea. Well, it tells me even less if I have a child who has a very significant cognitive delay, because sometimes people say, well, this child is 10 years old, but they have a functioning level of a 2-year-old. Well, no, they don't, because they may, according to that test, they may do some of the cognitive skills that a 2-year-old does, but they don't function like a 2-year-old. They function like a 10-year-old who has a cognitive impairment. But the thing that a curriculum reference assessment allows us to do is it allows us to track how a child is progressing with themselves as a measure. So I'm not measuring your progress against a typically developing child. I'm just saying, here are 10 skills that need to be learned, and you have 2 of them now. Here are things we're going to work on. Hopefully at next assessment period, you'll have 5 of them, and then 7 of them, okay? And here's what I mean by a routines-based assessment. So this is a form that's in building blocks. And so we think about the classroom activities, the classroom expectations, and then the child's level of progress. So in this slide, you can see that for Mateo, and this is in a childcare, the first classroom activity is check-in. So you cooperate with undressing, settle in at the first activity. So how does Mateo do at that? Well, he's fine. It's not a concern, okay? Music movement, sit with the group, begin to move, sing, listen, and play. Well, that's an area of concern. He's about average, but it's an area of concern. You can see that there are other things here where there are areas of concern. What that allows me to do now is to say, okay, what in that music time is the area of concern, and how can I address that? So there may not be an assessment that has, follow along with a group activity during, as a scale, as an item. On the AEPS, which we use a lot, there's only 2 items on the whole assessment about imitation, because most children learn how to imitate. But I work with children with autism. Learning to imitate is a huge thing. So that, those 2 items don't give me enough information. So I need to know, can they imitate at group? Can they, if all of the rest of their peers are doing a, head, shoulders, knees, and toes song, can they do the movements with their peers? And here's another, here's just some more examples. So outdoor time, you can see, is an area of concern. Playing with others, playing on equipment. Nap time, strength. Awesome. That's good. But really, we all know kids where nap time is not a strength, right? And we have to address that. But luckily for Mateo, it's a strength. Diapering is an area of concern. And snack is an area of concern. So his teachers have a lot of concerns. One of the things that we might want to do with something like this is really talk about what are the biggest concerns, because we don't want to try to do everything and then do nothing well. So here, again, is an idea of the IFSP. This is his IFSP today. So this is a form that we would then use to say, here is what we're working on. Here are his goals and the domains that are from his IFSP. Now, we all know, last time we looked in IFSP, that they are not the most user-friendly forms in the world. right? They are federal or state forms that are, are procedurally correct and not easy to use. So here what we can do is say, okay, here are the goals that we're working on. We're going to work on him walking a little bit by himself, imitating, using some words to communicate, feeding himself, and some exploration to make toys work. And then here's what we want that to look like. So therefore, if the teacher who wrote the IFSP is not working with him, this is written in clear enough language that anyone will know what this means, okay? The other thing that it does is that when I'm planning, when my team sits down to plan, that I say, okay, I know that I need to make sure that there are that he's using words to communicate. So what is he really interested in talking about? How can I make sure that those things are always present for him? When I say he's going to imitate actions at music time, I have to make sure that at every music time there is an imitation activity. So this is another child, Drew, that we're doing this with. He's a little bit older, and he's in more of a preschool as opposed to childcare. So we see that the first thing is arrival. So he has a hard time staying with the group and getting into class. That's a big concern for the teachers. That's an area of concern. Circle time, average. There's no concern there. Small group time, they have problems with him sharing materials and staying at the table. Free choice time, also an area of concern. And you can see that, again, cleanup and transition, an area of concern. Snack is an area of concern. Outdoor, strength, yippee. It's always good to know there's a strength. And then departure, again, like arrival, an area of concern. One of the things that this does too, that using this worksheet can do, is it helps teachers focus in on what would help the student do better, right? Rather than saying, I'm sure everyone's met with someone who says they are all over the place all the time, So no, let's go activity by activity, area by area, and talk about when things are going well and when they need to improve. And so here's a planning sheet for Drew. So we say we want him to interact appropriately with materials. And so again, you can see that his current objective, he can do it for about 5 minutes with a prompt, and we want him to do it for 10 minutes independently. But right now, we're just working on doing it for 5 minutes, and then he can get up and do something else, and he gets some prompting during that time. Right now, we're working on him following directions from an adult, and now he's following a one-step direction, and he has a visual cue. Okay, so you can see how we stair-step these. Okay, and I'm just going to move on so that I get through some of these. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how we've identified our concerns, and now we're going to start doing some planning. So again, this one is with Drew, and we really talk about 3 levels of intervention here. Okay, we're talking about curricular modification. What can we change in the environment to help Drew be more successful, or any child be more successful? ELO, embedded learning opportunity. How do we embed instruction in the ongoing activity? And then child-focused instructional strategy, where that may be for something where other children may not be working on that goal, and we may want to pull that child aside and do some more intensive instruction. So let's walk through here and see how we're going to plan this for Drew. So in small group activity, we see that the concern is that he grabs materials from children who are seated next to him, and he needs a great deal of adult attention to stay engaged with the activity. So what are we doing now? He's assigned to a seat. A teacher sits next to him. When the materials are put on the table, he often grabs the most preferred ones and won't share. The teacher must intervene. So what are we going to do? Okay. Well, number one, we're going to limit the amount of time he has to stay at the table. So we're going to work for shorter periods of time, and then say, okay, you're all done. You can have a break before you come back. So he's going to work independently for 5 minutes. He's going to respect some boundaries, which means that we're going to set up some boundaries. So again, you can see that those are 2 ways we're modifying the curriculum. Okay, we're setting time limits, having shorter activities, and we're changing the physical environment. So one of the hard things about table time is if you put materials on the table, how do you know what is yours, and how do you know what is your neighbor's? How do you know what you need to share? So what we do here is we're going to put his materials on a tray, and then the rule is if it's on the tray, it's yours. If it's not on the tray, you have to ask. Okay? So we're taking something that's very abstract and we're making it concrete. Okay? So that's one of the ways that we can help this child be more independent without an adult having to be there. Okay? So it makes it a really simple rule. If it's on the tray, it's yours. If it's not on the tray, you have to ask. Well, what if there's, Play-Doh, you put Play-Doh out there that everyone can use? Does he have to ask? Yeah, we're embedding an instruction there that other kids may not have to use right now, but I'd rather over-teach that idea. If it's not on your tray, you have to ask, than to at the beginning say, well, unless it's in the middle, and what does middle mean? And it gets confusing. And you can see we go through that with every single one. So let's look at the one for transition. So Drew currently he does not respond to the transition signal if he's at a preferred activity. I bet this sounds like some children right? If he is at a non-preferred activity, he runs or wanders around the classroom. So right now what happens is that someone has to go over to him independently, repeat the instruction individually, physically help him with the transition, and he often has a tantrum. So we're going to use embedded learning opportunities here. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a picture schedule. We will go through the picture schedule at the beginning of the day. At each transition, we're going to show him the schedule and say, now it's time for X. One of the things I think that happens, especially for some of our children who are English language learners and children with autism, is that we sometimes don't know what their receptive language level is. This really happens with our kids with autism because children with autism may have better expressive skills than receptive skills, which is completely opposite of how most children learn language. Most children have better receptive skills than expressive skills. They can understand more than they can say. So if I have a child with autism who has a lot of scripted language and can say lots of stuff, but then I give him a simple instruction and he doesn't follow it, he may not understand that language. So making things very visual, again, making that abstract concrete is a great way to go. Now, once we decide what we're going to work on, especially with ELO, we need to create a plan because, again, everyone in the classroom needs to know what we're doing, okay? Doesn't work for just the teacher and the assistant teacher to know. Everyone who comes in that classroom, if there are volunteers, if there's a music teacher, whomever comes in needs to know. So you can see here it says that with Drew, we're on transitions, and the objective is when shown a picture and given an instruction, Drew will follow the instruction. So it asks very simple questions. What are you going to do? I'm going to show Drew a picture. What are you going to say? Drew, go to circle. And I'm never going to say, Drew, do you want to go to circle? Because when he says no, that's the correct answer. So I'm going to say, oh, okay, well, play for 1 more minute. I'll come back. But Drew, go to circle. How will you respond? So if Drew follows the instruction, I'm going to praise and remind what he just did. If not, repeat the instruction and physically assist him to the circle, okay? But one of the things that happens sometimes is that, you know, when I'm moving kids around the room, they may not know where I'm moving them. So having this predictability is going to help him. Now, the great thing is that I'm going to be able to do lots of opportunities every day, and then I can write notes here about how it goes, okay? And so I can evaluate how the instruction is going. Okay, so I want to stop here for 1 minute before we get to this part and just ask if anyone has any questions. I know I'm going super fast. Yes, ma'am.
What's the ELO?
Okay, so the question is, what is ELO? And ELO, and again, you know, this is a whole book, and I'm just doing this very fast overview. So ELO stands for Embedded Learning Opportunity. So it's the idea of taking an instructional trial and embedding it into the activity with the least amount of disturbance to the routine as possible. So a really simple example of ELO is, let's say I have a child who doesn't know colors, and he is behind where he should be in knowing his colors, but he loves the sensory table. So, I can teach him colors at the sensory table by, burying dinosaurs in the sand and having him find dinosaurs and label them, or point to the red one, or, all kinds of stuff like that. If that's and he may be more motivated to work on that than if I just sit him down and get the little plastic bears out and say, point to red, point to blue. So I'm embedding it in something that's of interest. Sometimes you have an activity like transitions that it's impossible to teach if you don't embed it. Right? But even when you're teaching concepts or conversation or social skills, when you embed it, it makes it more authentic because I care more about it. So even things like if I have a child and they're, let's say my goal is to get them to stay at an open-ended activity for longer. So one of the activities we do is collages. We like to do a lot of collages and open-ended art activities. Now for many kids, those are super fun. They love them and they get really creative. For children who don't do well with open-ended activities, I just see all this material in front of me and I'm like, I'm out of here. I'm not doing it. So I can again make that really abstract activity concrete by saying, by drawing a circle and a square and a triangle and a star on their paper and then having shapes there for them to match. And when they match them all, I can say, you're all done, and they can leave, and if they want to come back, they can. But again, I just made this really open-ended, potentially scary activity short and fun and where they can be successful. And they're working on matching, so I'm embedding matching into their art activity rather than coming over and saying, okay, we're going to work on matching now. So it's just another way of, kind of rephrasing or rethinking when instruction happens. And so, it's like when I first started teaching, we used to have language time. Okay, we're going to do language time. And, now I think most people would say, well, language time is all the time, right? We don't have language time because all day long is language time. And in the same way, all day long is instruction time, so rather than saying we're going to do instruction here and instruction there and instruction here, we should be doing instruction all over. But if we don't plan it, we know it won't happen. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I'm moving on. Okay, so I want to just talk really briefly about what an instructional loop is and what it may look like for a child with a disability. So we know that one of the reasons I think it's, one of the reasons I like to talk about this is that it's really important when we're talking about children who may have learning difficulties to make sure that we're closing those instructional loops. What we know is that when we close the instructional loop, that we see an increase in child performance. Children learn things more quickly. And the reason I like this term instructional loop is that for me, I like to visualize it as, you know, those chains that we often, paper chains that we often make, you know, and, you know, you put one loop inside the next, inside the next, inside the next, and they get longer and longer and longer. I like to think of this in this way, that, you know, if you don't close the loop, the chain falls apart. But if you close the loop, then you can have a longer and longer chain, and kids can learn more and more from that. So when I think about an instructional loop, the first thing is to provide a cue, whether that's an instruction or a question. But when it's a cue, it's something that the child, there's an obligatory response for, okay? That I want the child to respond, and in the pragmatic rules of the day, we know that the child should respond. And it could be, stand up, come here, tell me what you're doing. What color are you painting with? You know, there could be any number of things. Observe the child's response. Observe the child's response and provide them with an opportunity to respond. One of the things we're not very good with as teachers is allowing silence, right? As you notice that I've been up here rambling for an hour without stop. But one of the things we always have to do is make sure that when we provide a cue, that we leave a minimum of 5 seconds for the child to respond. Minimum. So tell me what color you're painting with. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000. It's kind of a long time. And some children, you might do more. Okay, that's a minimum. And then provide feedback. And provide authentic feedback. So authentic feedback should be, wow, that green is one of my favorite colors. You're not good saying green. Who says that? Okay? You want to continue to engage with the child in a way that's authentic. Now, for some children, we need to make sure we provide assistance. And it's important to understand that the assistance comes before the child's response. Okay? So if I say, what color are you? What color is that dinosaur? 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000. And there's no response. I might say, tell me green. That dinosaur is green. And he says green. You're right. That green dinosaur is in the sand. Okay, I'm always adding a little bit more. Okay, I'm always adding a little more information. Always commenting. You know, it goes back to that Goodhart and Risley research that tells us the more words children hear, the more words children say. Okay, we know that that's good with kids with disabilities as well. Now, we call that give assistance. We call that a prompt. Okay. Now the prompts can be very effective, but here's the bad part about a prompt. We can teach children to be very reliant on prompts, and we call that being prompt dependent. So this happens especially with kids with disabilities, where we will see children, when you give them an instruction, they just stop and look at you like, well, I know you're eventually going to do that for me, so why should I do it for myself, you know? So we want to be careful that every prompt we add, we know we need to take away, okay? So if I say to a child, hey, you need to stand up, and they do that, that's great, but I added a prompt. What was my prompt there? The visual, right. So I want children to be able to say, stand up, okay? Now, I might also want everyone to be able to stand up if I just do this, which is a nonverbal instruction, okay? But I want to do one or the other, okay? I don't want to have to give both, okay? I want to be very careful. Now, I think that there's one special kind of prompt that we don't need to remove, and that is our visual prompts, or picture, here that we call them picture prompts, because we all use picture prompts. Because anyone who is reliant on your phone or your calendar or your list to tell you what you need to get done today, you are schedule dependent. And that's okay. It's okay to be schedule dependent. But what I always say is that most of us who are schedule dependent don't have schedules that include pocket charts that we're carrying around with us, right? They're age-appropriate schedules. So we want people to be as independent as possible, and if a schedule or a list makes you more independent or even more secure, that's okay. But we don't want people to have to use schedules if they don't need them. You know, like I have a schedule, but I don't need to look at my schedule every 10 minutes. You know, I look at my schedule every morning and say, can I wear yoga pants to work today? And if I can, it's a good day. You know, and then I look at what appointments I have. But you know, I don't have to look at it to say, you know, it's time to you know, to hit the print button after I, you know, write a paper. Okay. Now there are different kinds of prompts, right? Verbal prompts, gestural prompts, you know, picture, model, partial physical, full physical. They all have advantages and they all have disadvantages. I'm just going to tell you two, and I'm not going to go into this because we could spend the rest of the 2 days on this topic. Verbal prompts, you have to be careful because remember, you've already given an instruction. So if I say, okay, stand up, and they don't, if my verbal prompt is stand up, stand up, stand up, stand up, how many times am I going to repeat myself, right? And why do I think that that's adding any extra information? One of the things a prompt should do is add extra information to help ensure a correct response. So I always say there's a very thin line between verbal prompting and nudging, and we don't want to go there, so we need to be careful. The other issue is physical prompting. So, you know, I hear some teachers tell me, oh, we can't use physical prompting, we don't touch children. And I think we have to be very careful because we all use physical prompting. You know, sometimes it's even things like, let me show you how to hold your pencil, or point to this one, or, you know, let me help you zip up your coat, or whatever it is. But we want to make sure that we're not overly physically prompting. You know, we don't have to have hands on kids if we don't need to. So one example I always say is in walking around the school, is it's very nice when a teacher wants to hold, or a child wants to hold a teacher's hand, or a teacher wants to hold a child's hand. And the issue is, if you're doing that because you want to, that's great. If you're doing it because it really is almost restraint, because if you don't hold the child's hand, they're going to run away, that's a problem, okay? Because it's one thing when you're 4 or 5 and you're walking into class holding the child's hand, and when you're 15, it's inappropriate, and when you're 22 and you no longer have, you know, special education services or an assistant, what's going to happen? So again, we need to make sure that we're not using these prompts as a barrier and not allowing the child to become more independent. Okay? Any questions about prompting? Okay, good. Moving along. So the next thing I want to talk about is a reinforcer assessment. So when I think about teaching, especially the children that I'm working with who may have more significant disabilities, I may need to use reinforcers other than teacher praise. So a reinforcer, and I'm a board certified behavior analyst, so you have to give me a minute here to just kind of geek out on you a little bit. But a reinforcer is a stimulus, it's anything, that follows a behavior that increases the likelihood of a behavior happening again, okay? So the thing about reinforcement, and when you really think about this, I think it's kind of remarkable, is that a reinforcer is all about future behavior. It really has nothing to do with the behavior that just happened. It already happened. The reason we use a reinforcer is to increase the likelihood that that behavior is going to happen again. So reinforcement affects all of us. It's probably the strongest behavioral principle we have, and it's been evaluated across cultures, abilities, species, ages. But here's an example. So my husband thinks he's quite funny, thinks he's quite the jokester. If he tells a joke and people laugh, I can guarantee you that I'll hear that joke again, right? When someone tells a joke, you laugh at them, that's the reinforcer, right? Now, if he tells a joke and people groan, I will hear that joke again. Because it's important to remember that the function of the reinforcer is on the behavior and how it's interpreted by the person who demonstrated the behavior, not the person who provided the reinforcer, okay? Now, if he tells a joke and people actually walk away, I won't hear that joke again, okay? But it's really important for us to remember that if a child engages in a behavior and I give them a very stern talking to, but that increases, the behavior continues to happen, it increases the frequency of the behavior, then that very stern talking to is actually functioning as a reinforcer. I don't mean it as a reinforcer, but it's functioning as a reinforcer. So that's why it's so important for us to measure behavior, because it may be that the child, what they're trying to achieve is some attention, and any kind of attention is okay to them, okay? Now, what we know is that reinforcers are individual. So something that would be a reinforcer to you might not be a reinforcer to me. And like a really easy way to think about this is tastes in music. So if I put on a Luzo CD, you might say, this is awesome, and other people might say, huh? Who's that? What are you talking about? I don't like that. So we really need to say, you really need to think about how it works for the individual. So we need to find things that are reinforcers for children. And the best way to do that is to observe the child. So if the child just comes into a classroom, what do they do? When they first walk in, what do they do? Now, all kids will do something. Even those children who say they don't have any play skills, they still do something. What do? Do they feel the different surfaces? We all have kids who are those sensory kids. They like to rub stuff, okay? We have other kids who will go to the window and kind of squint out at the light or look at the light. We have other kids that noise and sound is something that they really like to do. Or other kids who like sensory stuff, so they like to spin things. A little boy, my very first experience with inclusion was helping a little boy. I worked at actually a residential school for children with autism, and he would participate in the local Head Start classroom a few days a week. And this little boy could spin anything. In fact, he could spin little Legos, not Duplos, little Legos, and get them spinning like a top. And so we had a very strict no spin rule in Head Start. But one day I walked in, and he was giving a little spin workshop. So there were like 5 children surrounding him, and he was showing them how to spin Legos, And so at that moment, again, I had to say, now do I enforce the rule, which, the rigid side of me wanted to do, or do I say, he's making friends? And just say, hey, I didn't see that. I'm just going to pretend I didn't see that. So getting back to reinforcers, how do we find them? We observe what children do. We offer choices. We ask the family, we ask the child, and we teach. We teach. Because I think it was Beverly Boz said, if you haven't had it in your hand, you can't learn it. I think she said it much more elegantly than I just said that. But if you've never played with a toy, it can't be reinforcing, right? if you've never eaten a food, you don't know if you're going to like it or not. So if you've never played with a toy, you don't know if you're going to like it. So many children have a very limited experiences with some of the materials we have in the classroom. So we need to teach them how to use them, and then they can become more reinforcing. So I think about children with puzzles. Many kids really like to do puzzles, but so it may be that they start to do the puzzles, and then the ones that are easy become a reinforcer to them. But then we still need to always be teaching them more challenging puzzles. And those easy ones can be things that they are reinforcing for them, but we're going to teach them how to do more challenging puzzles, because we don't want to have a child who, they're 9 and they can still only do a 4-piece puzzle, right? We want to be working on more challenging ones. Okay. And the reinforcer is important, because this is when I'm pointing at this like you can see it. This is how we provide feedback. Okay. So this is, for most children that we work with, providing feedback of participating in the activity, really behavior-specific social praise is going to be strong enough reinforcement. It's going to be very effective. But when I have children who have primary social deficits, social and communication deficits, like children with autism, that may not function as a reinforcer. So I may have to find other things, like after you participate in circle time, which may be hard, you get to play with the spinning toy. Or after you participate at snack, and especially for kids who don't like food, who aren't good eaters, you get to go outside and run, okay? Or you get to bounce on a ball. But they can be this, first this and then that, but I need to know what those reinforcers are. And they can be so powerful that they can really help kids learn, and then learn to be reinforced by things that are in the classroom. Okay, now I'm going to get to my favorite part, when to teach. And this is the part about when across the day do we embed instruction. So this is, I mentioned earlier activity matrix. And again, if I were to, if someone made me queen of education and said everyone had to do one thing that I said, I would have everyone use an activity matrix. Because when we first started using these, when we first started doing work on our first edition of Building Blocks, and we use them in our school, this is what we found. So at first we got a lot of pushback, because every time you do anything new, you get pushback. So that was okay. But then what we found was that teachers said, what I realized is that I had IEP objectives that I had completely ignored all quarter, because you can't keep them in your head. Every kid has at least 10 objectives, and you have 15 kids, that's 150 objectives. You're younger than I am, but I can't keep those in my head. So and the IEPs are so unwieldy that they're hard to keep track of. So we can put them on one piece of paper, so we can make sure we're planning for them and implementing them. So this is how we do that. So we have down the side of the column your routines or schedule or activities or whatever you want to call that, okay? We have across the top the individual objectives. And this is an individual child activity matrix, okay? This is for one child. So this is great if you have maybe 1 or 2 kids with IEPs in your classroom. This works really well. So you can see that on arrival, we're going to be working on responding to others' conversational topics, and we're going to be using embedded learning opportunities to do that. Now, sometimes when I work with teachers to develop these, they say, "Oh, this is a lot of work." Well, you only really have to do it once a year, and then update it as necessary, because you do it after the IEP, meeting. It's part of implementing the IEP. So, and then you update it, but then it's there for your planning time. So you say, okay, during small group activity, we're working on interacting with materials and preferred, and we're using environmental support, but what materials are we going to have him work with today? Okay, who's going to be doing that? Who's doing that instruction? Now, the other thing this allows us to do is if you want to be, people use these in all kinds of different ways. But if I want to make sure I take data at least once a week on every one of these objectives, I can use the same piece of paper and write my data right on the paper. If I have other data sheets I prefer to use, I can write the data on another data sheet and then fill in my box when I've collected data on that objective. Now I'm going to show you a couple more activity matrices. So here, this one is still Drew, and here you can see where they're matching routine objectives and routines. So he's working on snack, and he's using most to least prompting to respond to general knowledge questions. I think that, yeah, to general knowledge questions. So you can see that you can use this in many, many different ways. Okay, and here's another one with Drew. And again, it's talking about, I actually think this is just a repeat of the other one. Sorry about that. Okay, now here is another, I think this is another child's activity matrix. And you can see that this is for Mateo, and he's in childcare, so he has different kinds of activities and different kinds of skills that he's working on. Okay, so on single words, we're going to work on that on certain times a day. On cruising, he's going to work on that outside. Different times a day, you're working on different things. One of the things I always want to make sure that people take into consideration, I want to go back to Drew's to look at this, is that you have to think about what staff availability you have, and do you in fact have time to do instruction. So often when I sit down with teachers to work on these, they'll plan a whole bunch of instruction during arrival. And I say, so do you really have the staff to make sure that everyone gets in the classroom and situated safely and do instruction? Like, is that really the best time to be doing instruction? Or could you be doing it at another time of the day? Okay, so that's one thing to consider. But let me tell you how I sit with a teacher to start doing this with one child and then move it to the classroom. And then I'm going to show you a classroom matrix. So if so let's say we know Drew has, this is his schedule, and then for Drew, I'm going to say these are his objectives, and that's what we know for Drew. But let's say I have 5 kids with IEPs in my classroom. I don't want to have to flip through 5 pieces of paper, okay? So what I'll do is I'll take Drew's, and then I'm going to transfer it onto a classroom activity matrix, and say, instead of in this column, in this space right here, I'm going to write Drew, and I'm going to take all these boxes and put them under this column. Then I'm going to do the same thing with Adam, and the same thing with Sarah. And then this is what I end up with. So this is actually an activity matrix that someone in our school uses. So I cut off the names off the top, but you can see down the side, they just took a big calendar and they decided to use Post-its, which I hate. So wouldn't be the way I would do it, but that's what happens is when someone else implements, you have to let them implement the way they're going to do it. And so they have the names across the top, and then down this column, you can see that for this one child, at circle, they're working on 2-word combinations. On snack, they're working on commenting on activity using words or pictures. On free choice, they're reciprocal play with peers, imaginary play sequences. And they have it for all these different children. Now, the first time I used this picture, someone said, what do the different color Post-its mean? And it means that they ran out of the first color Post-its. So like it was so funny because they asked me and I was like, I don't know. And so I went back and the teacher said, oh, we just ran out of pink Post-its. I was like, oh, okay. Great. So, does anyone have questions about an activity matrix, either making one or using one or the appropriateness of one? Yes.
So if you're in an inclusion classroom setting with like a co-teaching model, would this be something that the two teachers together could like create? Or?
That's a great question. So the question was, if you are in a co-teaching model, is this something that two teachers would create together? Absolutely, because, and actually all these things together, you would, even identifying what the goals and objectives are, where the student has, problem, has issues. But I would include not just the two teachers, but anyone else, like any specialists that come into your classroom, they should be in here too. So for example, if you have someone who comes in to work on motor skills, then you have to say, so when is the best time for you to work on motor skills with these kids? So often it's outside, but maybe not. Maybe it's small group, or maybe it's free choice, because at free choice, kids have more opportunity to come and go, and so actually that's a better time. Okay, and then. But when are we going to do that? And we not only plan when the intervention is going to happen, but what materials, when we plan week to week, then we can say, what materials do I need to make sure I have out so that we can work on those objectives? So, one of the things I think is really important is that sometimes when we start to do these activity matrices, people will say, well, we work on these all day long. Like the one about using two-word combos. I work on that all day long. And I always say, that is so great. I'm happy that you work on that all day long. But when are you going to ensure that you're taking data, that if I really wanted to come in and watch your instruction, I could be sure to see it? When is that really good specially designed instruction, not just practice, but really specially designed instruction for kids who qualify for special education going to happen? And that's what I want them to identify on the matrix. Any other questions about these before we move on? Okay, I only have 9 minutes, so I'm going to go through here. Okay, so implement the plan. So, we all know that you can have the best laid plans. If you don't implement well, they're not going to happen. So we want to make sure that we collect data, and we can collect data in all kinds of ways. So I always say the best kind of data are the data that are collected. Because I can have the prettiest data sheet in the world, and if it doesn't get used, then it doesn't matter. It's really not very pretty because it's empty. So for some children, for some teachers, plus and minuses work. For some teachers, a daily rating scale of 1, 2, 3 works. For some teachers, they like to write notes. Whatever works for you in your classroom, but you want it to be something that you can see progress. So like here, these are all the different transitions that Drew has during the day. And so basically we're saying for that transition, did he do it well? Did he do it correctly? Or did he not do it correctly? And you can see here that he's kind of staying right at the same area. He starts out at 3, 2, 4, 4. He's not making a ton of progress here. If I came in and looked at this now, I'd probably say, we probably need to do something a little bit more. What else could we do? But we can also use this evaluation worksheet that is also in the book. So we can say, again, this is with Drew, and so we can say, our objective is for him to work 5 minutes. This is what he did today. He took Molly's glue bottle. On Monday, he took Molly's glue bottle. On Thursday, no grabbing. Did the plan work? Yes. So what am I going to do next week? So when the team meets every week, we can say, is this getting better? How'd it go? Do we need to do something different? What are we going to, how are we going to move forward, okay? Because, again, collecting data and not talking about it is a waste of time and paper, okay? So the only reason you want to collect data is to talk about it so that you can improve your instruction. And here's an example for Mateo, who's in the child care program. So you can say that, you know, how much we're looking at how much liquids he drank, his diapering, and then these are his objectives: pointing to toys, cruising, and then any notes. So he has something that they can fill out for him. And then again, here's his evaluation worksheet. So did the plan work? What did they do? How did it work? And here's another kind of data that we could take, where this is one of my favorite data sheets. So you can see, and this is again is in the Building Blocks book. So if we say we want him to cruise across those 4 chairs, the great thing about this is that you can take the data and graph it on the same piece of paper. So basically, you circle the number if it's correct, and you put a slash through it if it's incorrect, and then you connect the dots by a percentage. So you can see the first, or you just connect the dots. So you can see that it's on a little bit of an upward trend, but you can see that the first day he did it 3 times, the second day he did it 1 time, the third day he did it 4 times, the 4th day he did it 2 times. So hopefully he'll get up there and the trend will continue to increase. But again, if you really like to have data, this is a very simple way to do it, okay? But the best data collection are the ones that you use. One of the things our teachers do now in our preschools is for some of the data they really want to collect, they have 3x5 cards that they've laminated, and they keep them on a pulley, a little keychain thing on their belt loop. And then they write notes on them, and at the end of the day, they transfer it to a data sheet. So they really like doing it that way, whatever works for you. Okay, so let's review. So the first thing is that we need to make sure that we identify the concerns and priorities, because if we identify high priority behaviors, we're going to be more likely to work on them. One of the things, when you solve a problem for a team, that team is going to invite you back into their classroom over and over and over again, because they feel successful and they feel like the child has been successful. We need to plan, we need to assess, we need to plan, and then we need to implement the plan. Because each of those steps each step requires that we work systematically to teach and to improve the outcomes for all of these kids. So I just want to thank you for your attention, and I'm here for a couple more minutes if anyone has any questions. So thank you very much.